Back in the year of 1878, the land stretched wide and hard under a sky that was more often pale with dust or bruised with storms than it was a gentle blue. Out here, on the fringes of settled territory, life was stripped down to bone and muscle, a constant wrestling match with the elements and the stubborn, untamed earth. Men worked until their hands bled and their backs ached, wrestling fences into existence, coaxing grudging life from the soil, and facing down the loneliness that settled deep in the marrow like the winter cold. Thomas Beckett was one such man, built like the sturdy fence posts he drove into the prairie, weathered and quiet, his face etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and a grief that had carved out a hollow space inside him years ago. He ran a small ranch, isolated miles from the nearest settlement, a collection of rough-hewn buildings and dust-choked streets known, with a grim sort of humor, as Prosperity Creek. Prosperity was a fleeting notion out here, clinging to the edges of existence like a starved coyote. Thomas's ranch was barely more than a cabin and a few outbuildings, a scatter of cattle his sole company most days. He was a capable man, strong and resourceful, but beneath the stoic exterior lay a quiet despair. His wife, Mary, had died 5 years prior, taking with her not just his heart, but the future they had planned. They had dreamed of a family, of small hands helping with chores, of laughter echoing in the cabin, but Mary had been frail, and the land was unforgiving. After her death, Thomas had buried that dream alongside her, packing it away like precious, fragile things in the back of his mind, too painful to touch. The silence in the cabin was a constant, heavy presence, a reminder of what was lost and what would never be. The doctor had told him, gently but plainly, after a riding accident years before Mary, that children were not in his future. The words had fallen like stones into the well of his hope, hitting bottom with a final, echoing splash. Mary had known, of course, and her love had been steadfast, but the unspoken weight of that fact had been another burden they carried, quietly, together. Now, alone, the impossibility of a child felt like the ultimate barrenness, reflecting the emptiness within. He was a man who worked the land, sought growth, but was himself incapable of fostering new life. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. He had built fences, cleared fields, raised cattle, all acts of creation, yet the one creation that mattered most was forever out of reach. This sterile truth had calcified around his grief, hardening him, pushing him further into himself, making the isolation less a circumstance and more a chosen state. The world beyond his fences felt increasingly alien. The westward push brought new faces, new conflicts. Rumors drifted to Prosperity Creek of the Comanche, their lands shrinking, their way of life under siege. Stories, often cruel and devoid of understanding, were told in the saloon, tales of raids, of resistance, painted always in shades of savage violence. There were whispers, too, of government camps, places where displaced tribes were held, ostensibly for their own good, but more often places of squalor and despair. Thomas usually tuned out the talk, focusing only on the practicalities of survival, the price of cattle, the forecast of the next storm. He had no quarrel with anyone, wanted only to be left alone. But then, something shifted. A circuit rider, passing through the sparsely populated area, stopped at Thomas's ranch seeking shelter from a sudden squall. Over weak coffee, the man spoke not of sermons, but of the state of things, the grim reality of the work camps. He spoke of desperation, of conditions that led people to unthinkable acts. He spoke of a particular camp, further south, notorious for its harshness, where families had been broken, and people were treated less than human. He mentioned, almost as an aside, something that snagged in the desolate corners of Thomas's mind. Women, some young, were being offered, a polite word for sold, to men who wanted wives or labor, Comanche women. The word Comanche barely registered. It was the word offered, the cold transaction, that struck him. And then a half-formed thought, born not of desire, but of a deep, aching practicality and perhaps a flicker of something he dared not name, began to take root. A woman, a helper. Someone to break the silence. The idea was raw, uncomfortable, born of a sterile need, not a tender one. It felt transactional, brutal even, like buying a workhorse. But the silence, the endless pressing silence, it was a beast that was slowly devouring him. And the knowledge that children were impossible, meant the ache for connection took a different, perhaps less conventional, form. He wasn't seeking a wife in the traditional sense. He was seeking a cessation of the silence, a presence, a buffer against the encroaching emptiness. The infertility, once a source of grief, now seemed to grant a strange, distorted permission for this thought. A wife meant hopes, meant dreams of a future he couldn't build. A purchased woman from a desperate situation, that was something else. Something starker, perhaps less likely to awaken the ghosts of Mary and the lost future. He wrestled with the idea for weeks. It felt wrong, deeply wrong, to buy another human being. His conscience, quiet but persistent, pricked at him. But the circuit rider had painted a grim picture of the camp, of people starving, of women facing fates far worse than a lonely rancher's cabin. Was it rescue, in a twisted way? Or was it simply giving in to his own needs, using another's desperation? The lines blurred in the harsh light of his isolation. The silence, the gnawing loneliness, the sheer physical labor required to keep the ranch afloat, it was wearing him down. He needed help, he needed something. The journey south was long and dusty. Thomas rode with a grim resolve, his pockets holding the sum total of years of careful saving. The camp was worse than the circuit rider had described. A collection of tents and lean-tos surrounded by a makeshift fence, guarded by men with bored, cruel eyes. The air hung thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and despair. People moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes dulled. He found the man in charge, a greasy individual named Brody, who sat behind a rough table counting coins. Brody didn't look up when Thomas stated his purpose. He simply gestured towards a section of the camp. "Pick one. Price is fixed, no returns." Thomas walked through the designated area, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He felt a profound sense of shame, a cold knot tightening in his gut. The women stood or sat, some staring blankly, others avoiding his gaze. They were thin, their clothes ragged, their eyes holding a terrible ancient sorrow. They were not meeting his eyes, their faces masks of resignation or weariness. And then he saw her. She sat apart from the others, near the fence, her back straight despite her thinness. She was young, perhaps 20 or so. Her face, though gaunt, held a striking dignity. Her hair was dark, braided neatly. Her eyes, when they flickered up and met his for just a second, were dark and intelligent, holding not resignation, but a spark of something else, perhaps defiance, perhaps just a deep, private sorrow. They were not dulled like the others. They seemed to see him, truly see him, not just as another potential buyer, but as a man standing there, awkward and out of place. He stopped in front of her. She didn't shrink away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Her," Thomas said, his voice rough. Brody grinned, a flash of yellow teeth. "Ah, Nahili, the quiet one. Thinks she's too good for everyone, might need a firm hand." Thomas ignored Brody. He looked at the girl, Nahili. Her name felt strange on his tongue, foreign. He didn't know what a firm hand meant to Brody, but he knew he didn't like the implication. He wasn't here to break anyone. He was here because he was broken. He paid the money, counted out coin by coin onto the rough table. Brody made them sign a paper, full of legal jargon Thomas barely understood, but the gist was clear: ownership. He felt the weight of the transaction settle on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. Brody tossed a worn blanket towards Nahili. "Get your things." She had nothing. A small, bundled piece of cloth was all she carried. She rose gracefully, her movements fluid despite her apparent weakness. She didn't look at Brody, didn't look at the others. Her eyes found Thomas's just for a moment, and in them he saw a flicker of something he couldn't decipher. Fear, yes, but something else too. Resilience? Judgment? He didn't know. The ride back was silent. Nahili rode behind him on the horse, her hand light on his waist. He could feel the fragile bones through the thin fabric of her dress. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't know what to say. He had just bought a human being. The reality of it was stark, ugly. He wasn't a slave owner. He was a rancher, a widower, a man who couldn't have children. What was he doing? When they arrived at the ranch, the cabin felt even smaller, the silence even louder, now filled with the unspoken weight of Nahili's presence. He dismounted and offered her a hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly steady. "My name is Thomas," he said, the first words he'd spoken to her directly. She nodded. She didn't offer her name, though he'd heard Brody say it. He didn't press. He showed her the cabin. It was simple, clean but Spartan. His life was Spartan. He showed her the small cot in the corner. "You can sleep there. There's food." He cooked a simple meal, beans and bacon. They ate in silence at the small table. Thomas watched her from the corner of his eye. She ate slowly, deliberately, not like someone starving, but like someone savoring each bite. There was a quiet strength in her, a composure that defied her circumstances. It unnerved him slightly. He had expected someone broken, weeping perhaps, or defiant in a loud, angry way. Not this quiet dignity. The first few weeks were a study in silence and observation. They moved around each other like wary animals, assessing, measuring. Thomas worked the ranch, rising before dawn, returning at dusk. Nahili stayed near the cabin. He didn't ask her to do anything at first, unsure of what was expected, or what he could expect. She seemed to understand the rhythm of the days. She cleaned the cabin without being asked, quietly and efficiently. She washed their clothes in a tub outside. She watched him. He felt her eyes on him sometimes, curious, perhaps judgmental. He learned small things about her by watching. She woke before him, sitting outside the cabin sometimes as the first light touched the prairie, her face turned towards the east. She seemed to communicate with the land, with the sky, in a way he didn't understand. She moved with a quiet grace, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. She spoke only when necessary, her voice soft, her English halting but understandable. She asked for nothing. He, in turn, revealed little. He kept his routine, his grief a silent wall around him. He didn't speak of Mary, didn't speak of the infertility, didn't speak of the ache that drove him to this strange arrangement. He simply provided food, shelter, safety from the outside world. Safety from Brody, from the camp, from whatever future she might have faced. It was a practical transaction, he told himself, a solution to loneliness and the need for help, for both of them perhaps. A cold, necessary thing. One evening, a sudden storm blew in, fierce and fast. The wind howled like a thing grieving, tearing at the cabin's shutters, rattling the very foundations. Rain lashed down, blurring the world outside. Thomas was securing a loose board when he saw Nahili standing in the doorway, watching the storm, not with fear, but with a strange intensity. "This is a big wind," he commented, stating the obvious, just to break the roar of the storm. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. "The land is angry," she said simply. He paused. The land was not angry, it was weather. But the way she said it, the belief in her voice, gave him pause. It wasn't just dirt and rock and grass to her, it was alive. "Just a storm," he said, more gently than he intended. "It washes away the dust," she said, looking back out, "makes things clean again." He considered that. Maybe it did. He finished securing the board and came inside. The cabin felt small and safe amidst the fury outside. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. Nahili sat on her cot, watching the fire. Were you taken?" he asked, the question coming out abruptly, surprising even himself. He hadn't intended to ask about her past. It felt invasive. She was silent for a long moment. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, she spoke. "My family, gone. Sickness. White man's sickness. The soldiers came, said I had no one. Took me to the camp." Her voice was flat, devoid of outward emotion, but the weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air. Gone. Family. Sickness. Soldiers. Camp. A life reduced to harsh, definitive words. His own grief, the carefully buried pain of Mary's loss, stirred within him, a familiar ache. He didn't know what to say. There were no words for that kind of loss, that kind of injustice. "I am sorry," he said, the words inadequate, foolish even, against the scale of her suffering. She looked at him again, those dark, intelligent eyes. "You bought me." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Yes," he admitted, the shame returning. "From Brody," he said. "I know what he said," she interrupted, her voice still soft, but with an edge he hadn't heard before. "He sells people like horses." "I needed help," he said, feeling defensive, then immediately hating himself for it. It sounded weak, self-serving. "And I needed Away, she finished for him. Away from there. She looked back at the fire. It is better here. The land, it is quiet, like my home used to be. It's a lonely place, he said. Lonely is better than dying slow, she replied, her gaze fixed on the flames. That night, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer just the emptiness he had grown accustomed to. It was a shared silence, filled with unspoken histories and the raw, fragile beginnings of something tentative and undefined. As the weeks turned into months, a rhythm developed between them. Nahili began to work alongside him, not because he demanded it, but because she chose to. She had an uncanny understanding of the land, of the animals. She knew where the best herbs grew, how to track, how to find water in unlikely places. She was quiet, efficient, and strong in a way that surprised him. She didn't complain about the hard work, didn't shy away from the dirt or the sun. He taught her about the cattle, about fences, about planting the small garden. She taught him, without words mostly, about patience, about observing the subtle language of the natural world. They worked side by side, the only sounds the wind, the lowing of cattle, the ring of his hammer, the soft tread of her feet. Slowly, cautiously, the wall around Thomas began to crumble. Her quiet resilience, her unspoken grief that mirrored his own in a strange way, reached something deep inside him. He saw her not as a possession, not as a Comanche woman, not even just as a helper. He saw Nahili, a person, a survivor, a quiet, dignified soul. One hot afternoon, the sun beat down relentlessly. They were mending a fence line far from the cabin. Thomas swung the hammer, sweat stinging his eyes. He stumbled, his leg cramping painfully. He swore, dropping the hammer. Nahili was instantly by his side. She didn't ask questions. She simply knelt, her fingers finding the knotted muscle in his calf. Her touch was firm, knowledgeable. She worked the cramp out with steady pressure, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Better?" she asked when she finished, her voice low. "Yes," he breathed, surprised by the relief. "Thank you." She nodded, gathering his tools. "We go back now. Sun too hot." He looked at her, at the simple care in her actions, the lack of fuss. It was the first time someone had touched him with kindness in years. The feeling was startling, unfamiliar, like coming across a hidden spring in the desert. Back at the cabin, she made a cool drink from roots she had gathered. She didn't hover, just offered it, and went back to her quiet tasks. He watched her, a new kind of awareness stirring within him. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. Somewhere along the miles of silent riding, along the weeks of shared meals and quiet work, something else had begun to grow. Dialogue became less strained, less functional. They talked about the weather, the land, the animals. He learned more about her past, snippets offered reluctantly, but offered nonetheless. Stories of her family, her tribe, their connection to the earth. He shared tentatively about his ranch, about Mary, skirting the edges of the deepest pain, but acknowledging the loss. He didn't mention the infertility. That felt too vulnerable, too shameful still. One evening, after the stars had come out, painting the vast sky with glittering patterns, they were sitting outside, enjoying the cooler air. "Your wife," Nahili said softly, breaking a long silence. "You miss her much." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a recognition of a truth he carried openly, even in his silence. "Every day," he admitted, his voice thick. "She was everything." "It is good to miss," Nahili said. "It means they were important. My mother, my father, my sister, I miss them. Like the wind misses the trees that are cut down." It was a strange poetic way of putting it, but he understood. A missing presence, a shape that was no longer there, leaving an empty space where movement and life used to be. He looked at her, silhouetted against the night sky. He saw her grief, raw and immense, yet she carried it with such quiet strength. And he saw, perhaps for the first time, the shared burden they both carried, the loneliness that had brought them together in this unlikely way. "We are both missing things," he said, the words feeling small against the enormity of their losses. She nodded slowly. "But maybe we can find new things, not the same, but light in the dark." Light in the dark. Was that what this was? Was he, a lonely, infertile rancher who had bought a woman, finding light in the dark with a Comanche girl who had lost everything? The idea was terrifying, fragile, and held a quiet possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Their connection deepened, slow and steady like a river carving a canyon. There was no grand declaration, no sudden shift. It was in the shared glance over the dinner table, the comfortable silence as they worked, the way she seemed to know what he needed before he asked. He found himself anticipating her quiet presence, looking forward to the end of the day when they would share the small cabin. He started leaving out small things for her, a ribbon he found in Prosperity Creek, a smooth stone from the creek bed, a wildflower he thought was pretty. She accepted them with a simple nod, a soft look from those dark eyes that spoke volumes. He began to see the prejudice in the nearby town more clearly now. When he went in for supplies, the storekeeper's questions felt sharper, the glances of the townsfolk harder. "Still got that Injun woman out there, Beckett?" They'd ask, their voices laced with disapproval or lewd suggestion. He felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. Nahili was not an Injun woman, she was Nahili. And she was with him. This growing connection, this tentative bond, was not lost on the outside world. A group of cattle rustlers, drifters who preyed on isolated ranches, rode through the territory. They saw Thomas's small spread, saw the smoke from his chimney, and saw opportunity. They also saw, or heard rumors of, the Comanche woman living there. Their cruel minds twisted the facts, seeing not a woman seeking refuge, but something to be exploited, something vulnerable and outside the protection of their twisted version of society's rules. The conflict arrived on a clear, hot afternoon. Thomas was out mending a distant fence when he heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin at a run. His gut clenched. Ranchers didn't ride like that unless there was trouble. He dropped his tools and sprinted back towards the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the small clearing to find 3 men on horseback outside his cabin. One was dismounted, swaggering towards the door. Another was laughing, holding a rope, his eyes fixed on the cabin. The third sat on his horse, watching, a rifle slung across his lap. They were rough-looking men, their faces hard and cruel. "Hey, Beckett!" the dismounted man yelled, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Heard you got yourself a squaw. We figure she belongs to the territory, not one man. We'll take turns." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Thomas. They weren't just threatening his property, they were threatening Nahili. The protective instinct, long dormant, flared into a burning fire. He didn't hesitate. He didn't have his rifle, but he had his hammer. He charged towards them, yelling, a wild sound torn from his throat. The men turned, surprised by his sudden attack. The one with the rope dropped it, fumbling for his pistol. The dismounted man stumbled back. The man on the horse raised his rifle. Thomas didn't stop. He swung the hammer, hitting the dismounted man in the shoulder. The man roared, dropping his pistol. Thomas lunged for it, scooping it up from the dust. The man on the horse fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Thomas's feet. He ducked behind a water trough, raising the stolen pistol. Just then, the cabin door burst open. Nahili stood there, not cowering, but holding Thomas's rifle, steady in her hands. He hadn't taught her to shoot it, but she had clearly watched him, learned its weight, how he aimed. She raised the rifle, aimed deliberately at the man on the horse, the biggest threat. The rifle cracked. The man cried out, clutching his arm, the rifle clattering to the ground. The other 2 men stared, stunned by the shot and the sight of the Comanche woman standing there, holding the rifle like she meant business. "Get out!" Thomas roared, stepping out from behind the trough, the pistol aimed steadily at the man with the injured arm. "Get out, and don't ever come back." The rustlers exchanged nervous glances. They were outnumbered, hurt, and clearly hadn't expected this kind of resistance, especially not from the woman. The man with the injured arm cursed, his face pale. "This ain't over, Beckett," the dismounted man snarled, scrambling back towards his horse. "Yes it is," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Ride." They scrambled onto their horses, leaving the dropped pistol and rope behind. They spurred their horses and galloped away, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Thomas stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline coursing through him. He lowered the pistol, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at Nahili. She still stood in the doorway, the rifle held ready. Her face was calm, determined. He walked towards her, towards the cabin. When he reached her, she lowered the rifle. Her eyes met his. They were clear, steady, and filled with a silent strength that took his breath away. "You knew how to use that," he said, stating the obvious again. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I watched you." "You saved me," he said. "We saved each other," she replied softly. In that moment, standing in the doorway of his small, rough cabin, the dust settling from the aborted attack, the bond between them solidified. It wasn't just about practical necessity anymore. It was about courage, loyalty, and a shared defiance against a world that wanted to break them both. The word "bought" felt like a distant echo, a sound from another life. It had brought them together, yes, but what had grown between them was something that could never be bought or sold. The aftermath of the confrontation changed things irrevocably. News traveled fast, even in the sparse territory. The story of the quiet rancher and the Comanche woman who defended their home with a rifle became a local legend, twisted and exaggerated with each telling. For some in Prosperity Creek, it confirmed their prejudices. The wild Injun woman was dangerous. But for others, it forced a grudging respect for Thomas Beckett and the unlikely partnership he had forged. He had defended his property, yes, but he had also defended her. Thomas didn't care about the talk. All that mattered was the quiet understanding that now flowed between him and Nahili. The barriers were gone, replaced by a deep, mutual trust forged in shared danger. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was comfortable, filled with the quiet presence of another soul. He began to rely on her judgment, on her knowledge of the land. She was more than a helper, she was a partner. He shared the decisions about the ranch with her, listening intently to her quiet observations. Her insights were often profound, rooted in a connection to the earth he could only admire. The infertility remained, a physical reality, a private sorrow he still carried. But the crushing weight of it had lessened. He couldn't have children of his blood, but he wasn't barren in spirit. He was nurturing something else, a bond, a partnership, a shared life built on mutual respect and affection. He had found a different kind of family, one not defined by blood, but by resilience, shared hardship, and unexpected connection. One evening, months after the attack, they were sitting outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors. It was a familiar ritual now, a quiet moment of shared peace at the end of the day. "Thomas," Nahili said, using his name easily now, "your sorrow, it is quieter now." He looked at her, surprised she had noticed, surprised she would voice it. "Yes," he admitted, "it is. The missing piece, it is still there," she said, her gaze steady, "but it does not fill everything." "No," he agreed, the words feeling true in a way they hadn't before. "It doesn't." He hesitated, then decided to speak a truth he had held back for so long. "Mary and I, we wanted children, couldn't have them. Doctor said I couldn't, after an accident. That's part of the quiet." He watched her face, braced for, he didn't know what, pity, disappointment. She was silent for a moment, processing his confession. Then she reached out, her fingers gently touching his arm. It was a simple gesture, but the tenderness in it was immense. "The spirits give life in many ways," she said softly, "not just one way. A plant grows, a calf is born, a bond grows between two people. These are also life." He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Her eyes were full of understanding, acceptance. She wasn't judging him, wasn't pitying him. She was simply seeing him. "Nahili," he said, his voice rough with emotion, I never thought I could have this quiet." "This is home now," she said, sweeping her hand to encompass the cabin, the fences, the wide open land around them. "Our home." Our home, the word settled deep within him, filling the hollow space that grief and loneliness had carved out. It wasn't the home he had planned, the future he had dreamed of with Mary. It was something different, something unexpected, born from hardship and injustice, but nurtured by resilience and a connection that transcended prejudice and circumstance. They built their life together on that quiet ranch. The physical scars of their pasts remained, unseen but present. The world outside still held its prejudices, its dangers. But within the fences of their home, they found a refuge, a partnership, a quiet love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. Thomas Beckett, the infertile cowboy, and Nahili, the Comanche girl bought from a harsh camp, had found not just survival, but something infinitely more precious. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found their soulmate. The land, once a reflection of Thomas's barrenness, now felt fertile with the quiet promise of a future built together, day by painstaking day, under the wide, forgiving sky. Their story became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for unexpected kindness to blossom in the harshest soil, and the profound truth that home is not just a place, but a bond forged between souls who choose to face the world together, finding belonging where they least expected it.